and welcome to GameSack. Have you ever wondered what the differences were when a game is released across multiple platforms? Of course you have. You want to make sure you're not missing out on anything else by choosing one version over the other. And you're in luck because in this episode, I'm going to compare some games. And let's start out with Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Yes, it's Zombies Ate My Neighbors on the Super NES from LucasArts and Konami. It came to the console in the latter part of 1993. It's simply called Zombies in Europe because they can't handle any neighbor eating. This is kind of a free-roaming overhead run and gun where you need to find all of your neighbors in each stage and rescue them. While you're doing this, all sorts of nefarious creatures and things are out to get you and also kill your neighbors. If you rescue all of your clueless neighbors, the exit opens up and you go to the next stage. Be warned though, your neighbors can die, but if they do, that's just one less you need to rescue. I'll say this, you certainly do have a lot of neighbors and they're all over the place. The entire game is basically a parody of the B-monster movies of yore. This is great. There are some more modernish things like this Splatterhouse guy, the Friday the 13th Jason guy with the chainsaw. You can collect many items and weapons throughout any given stage. Some weapons will let you blow through certain parts of hedges and walls. There are plenty of other items like keys to open doors. Or this clown which can distract enemies for you. His laugh sounds like the Joker's laugh bag from the end of the 1989 Batman movie. There are also items to heal yourself or potions you can drink which can screw you up for a little while. My favorite though is this potion which can turn you into a purple monster for a minute or two. This lets you break through walls and defeat enemies which normally would take much longer to bring down with conventional weapons. Conventional weapons being your default squirt gun. If you press one of the shoulder buttons, you call up a small radar to see if any of your neighbors are nearby and also see how many still need to be rescued. There are tons of levels to go through in this game. The good news is that a password feature is included and you get one every few levels or so. Even better is that the password is only 4 characters. That's super easy to remember and write it down or when inputting it later. The game is super repetitious, but somehow it just works. I do wish there were some more variety in the levels, but I'm glad it's not like how the first Sonic game was with a bunch of samey looking and sounding levels all grouped together. At least the music is changed up in each scene and the different level areas are interspersed throughout the entire game. It's fun exploring each level and 2 players can play at the same time. The graphics are fine, though certainly nothing mind-bending. The music is good and it evokes that B-movie feel for sure. Overall, this game is tons of fun. Zombies Ate My Neighbors then came out about 2 months later for the Sega Genesis. It's the same game with the same levels, but there are definitely some differences. The Super Nintendo was clearly the lead platform that the game was developed on, and the Genesis game was modified from that. The first thing you're going to notice is that giant black bar on the right side of the screen with a map that's not there in the Super NES game. You're going to be seeing a lot of these types of comparison screens in this episode, just saying. The Genesis game runs in a higher horizontal resolution than the Super NES game, so the play area is squished down so the bar on the right can fit. You might be wondering why the Genesis game just didn't run in the same resolution as the Super NES game since it does have that mode. I saw one website posit that this may have been because calling up the map with a button was easier to do on the Super NES since it had transparencies and more background layers. I'm gonna give a big thumbs down to that idea. That's not it. The real reason? The controls. You see, the standard Genesis controller only has 3 action buttons plus start. The Super Nintendo version of Zombies Ate My Neighbors uses 5 buttons. 4 to use and switch items, and the 5th to call up and put away the map. When using a 3-button controller on the Genesis, you need to hold A and then press either the shot or the item button to cycle through them, respectively. There's no way to call up the map without interrupting the action by pausing the game or getting rid of the pause feature altogether. So they just squished the screen down and now you have your radar up there all the time, and that makes it a complete non-issue for this port. The game does take advantage of a 6-button controller, but not everyone had one, and everyone still doesn't have one. It would have been cool if the game just stayed in the 256 pixel resolution mode if it sensed a 6-button controller though and you called up the map with the mode button, but I doubt they had much time to implement something like that. This version does switch to the Super NES resolution between levels though, so it's not like the thought of running the game in a lower resolution never occurred to them. Okay, so besides that, what are the other differences? Well, for one, the graphics fidelity and overall color has been sacrificed a little. It just looks worse on the Genesis. Not hugely worse, but noticeably. You certainly don't notice as much when you're just playing one or the other by itself, but seeing them side by side reveals which one you'd probably rather look at. The dripping blood on the Super Nintendo is purple, whereas it's red on the Genesis. You can actually blame Nintendo of America, they're the ones who made this call. Sound-wise, the Genesis once again falls short here. It uses the horrible GEM sound engine. Western developers, especially those here in the United States, didn't really know how to use anything else because I honestly feel that they didn't want to try as hard. And you needed to try harder on the Genesis to get quality results. It sounds pretty bad in comparison, both the music and the sound effects. The Genesis version does feature an option screen that the Super Nintendo game doesn't to let you switch around the controls. It also has the same convenient password feature, but the passwords are different than the Super NES game. Also, there's a hidden flamethrower weapon in the Super NES game that I can't get to here because I don't have a skull key. Damn it! The flamethrower isn't in the Genesis game because, well, who the hell knows why. Besides all that though, the games play the same and the Genesis one is still very fun. But when it's all said and done, the Super NES game certainly comes out on top. Now, I certainly wouldn't say that this next title is super popular or anything, but I still find the differences fascinating anyway. I mean, I enjoyed this game back then, so here we go. This is Valis III on the Genesis from Renovation, released in the US in June of 1991. This is a side-scrolling action platformer heavy on anime aesthetics. You control Yuko, who not only needs to save the entire world, but 3 of them. I'm not even going to get out of bed unless I have to save at least 2. Anyway, the story is told via some very well-drawn cutscenes for their time with some questionably translated text. The bad guy is Glames. What a great name. Here, let me fix that for you, Glames. There you go, now it suits you better. To save one of the 3 worlds, a girl named Cham steals your Sword of Valis. Then the game begins with you running after her in your jammies. She's suddenly accosted by a bad guy and she drops the sword. Uh-oh, you better go get that. You get it back and suddenly you have your skimpy armor on, which makes you look totally hot. The game works like the legendary axe on the mighty TurboGrafx-16. There's a bar at the top of the screen which empties every time you press the attack button, then automatically starts to refill. The more full it is when you press attack, the stronger your hit will be if it connects. You can collect icons to extend this bar to make your attack stronger, as well as icons to make it refill faster. You also have 3 different types of magic to collect, as well as a magic meter right below your life meter that you need to fill before magic can be used. You can also do a slide. Soon, you'll collect 2 other characters that you can switch between at any time, though the actual switching is kind of slow. There's Cham, who is basically a girl Simon Belmont, and Valna, who's Yuko's sister from another mister. She shoots these little fluff balls. Generally, I just use Yuko or the Castlevania chick. Weirdly, you need to press the start button to advance the text during the game screens. If you die and need to try an area over, any characters that you've already spoken to generally aren't able to be skipped. The game tosses a good challenge at you, but nothing persistence won't be able to overcome. The graphics run in the Genesis's low resolution mode, but they still look pretty damn good. It's got plenty of color and nice scrolling throughout. What's interesting is that if you pause the game and then press A and up, the game will interlace. Supposedly, this is to make the text easier to read on a CRT, but honestly, it really doesn't since the actual vertical resolution doesn't increase. I know because I tried this on a CRT. You can turn the game back to progressive scan by pausing it and then pressing C and up. That makes this the first game on the console to use interlacing in any way to my knowledge. The music isn't bad. It's not outstanding, but it works here. The sound effects during the cutscenes of the text slowly drawing onto the screen can sound a tad annoying though. Ugh. Overall, this was a fun game from 1991. In 1992, Valis III was released for the TurboGrafx-CD ROM. No Super System card required. Even though this was released later than the Genesis game here, it actually came out in 1990 in Japan, preceding even the Mega Drive version in that country. So in fact, this is the older game. As you'd expect, the cutscenes have real voices provided by actors of questionable quality.
Oh my god.
The story is also much more fleshed out here. Glames is now known as Ramses. There are entire characters and scenes here that were completely omitted from the Genesis game.
Of course not. Warriors of the spirit world never lose.
Otherwise, it's basically the same game with the same gameplay, except the TurboGrafx only has 2 buttons, so you need to use the run button to slide and select to pause. Unfortunately, the controls here feel nowhere near as good as the Genesis game. The physics of the jumping are all messed up. It has some very strange acceleration and deceleration applied. It's not good or natural at all. There are several places in the game with gaps that are too big to jump across. They're even too big to slide across. What you need to do is get to the very edge and then jump or slide across. If only they allowed the jumps to go further, this wouldn't be an issue. There are some extra levels here as well as some extended ones. These are missed in the Genesis game, but it can be hard to appreciate them here with the rather poor controls. Still, this haunted graveyard scene that's in the Turbo version looks pretty damn cool if you ask me. And you're watching my video, so I assume you did. The Genesis has its own unique level though, with this factory-like place with the background walls that keep moving horizontally and then vertically. Yay, I guess? I think I'd rather have the cool looking graveyard stage. This part here in the Turbo version is ridiculous. What you need to do is use ice magic to freeze the enemies and then use them to jump to the next pillar. You don't have much time to do this before the enemies unfreeze. This also eats up your magic meter and you can run out, being left completely helpless. It's also super easy to bounce back to your doom. It's gotta be some of the most piss-poor game design I've ever seen. Fortunately, the game saves your progress and you can try as many times as you'd like. And trust me, it's probably going to be more than a couple. The graphics run in the same resolution as the Genesis game. When both games are paused, the Turbo version looks nicer with some more detail and color in many areas. But when actually playing the game, the Genesis comes out on top simply due to the super nice parallax scrolling. The Turbo version looks so flat. One interesting difference is the first boss fight. It says NEC on the sign in the Turbo version, but on Sega it says Reno, short for renovation. The cutscenes look pretty similar, but of course the Turbo has more parts that are animated. Weirdly, the Genesis excels in the intro where it shows you pictures from the previous 2 games. The Genesis game actually describes what happened, but the Turbo game just plays music while showing a still image on screen for a very long time. So weird. The music, of course, is CD quality, but again, it's nothing outstanding. CD quality isn't always better than chiptunes, but generally, I think I like the CD music a bit more here. Here's a couple of quick comparisons for you. So yeah, the Genesis game is quite a bit shorter, but I still much prefer it over the Turbo CD version because it plays better and it doesn't have that stupid water level. Okay, this next one I've been kind of wanting to do for a while, and this episode actually presents the perfect opportunity to talk about this title. So with that, GameSack presents, Road and Track presents, The Need for Speed. That's right, it's Road and Track presents The Need for Speed, and it's presented by Electronic Arts Canada for the 3DO. It came out at the end of 1994. This is it, the very first Need for Speed game. Every Need for Speed you've ever played owes it to the 3DO here. In this game, you drive cars. That's pretty much it. You can drive a prosumer car like a Corvette or some higher-end cars like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. At the time, it was kind of a big deal to be able to get behind the wheel of a Dodge Viper. You have a first-person view which uses images of the dashboard from the real cars. Thanks so much for providing those, Road and Track magazine. They licensed the cars, but they didn't license the actual company logos, apparently. I mean, look at this half-assed Toyota logo here. Or the missing Ferrari logo here. The main menu is the most 90s thing ever. Ain't no time for text in the 90s. Instead, you get random pictures scattered all over the place. Way cool, dude. It's up to you to learn what the hell they all do. The menu is incredibly slow to navigate. So, you can race against the clock, or you can race against this super cool guy played by the late actor Brennan Baird. He likes to yell at you. That's awesome, because it's the 90s.
Oh, what's wrong? Does your little waste car driver want to go home?
You have 3 different tracks to race on, and they each have 3 segments. Each segment is several minutes long. All 3 tracks have traffic that you need to deal with. The city segment has one-way traffic, but the coastal and alpine tracks have two-way traffic, which is a bit tougher to deal with. Unfortunately, there really isn't much game here. Sometimes the cops will chase you, and if they pass you, you'll get pulled over and get a ticket. Once you beat that really cool guy, there's really nothing left to do, and he's honestly fairly easy to defeat. All you can do after that is try a harder difficulty or try to get a better time. Also, the controls are very slow and laggy. It feels like it takes your car quite some time to react to your input. It feels woefully unfinished as a game. However, back when this came out, I loved it anyway because this was truly the next generation of gaming. Keep in mind that the PlayStation and Saturn didn't exist yet. We were coming from 16-bit racing games that looked like this. So yeah, it's kind of a big difference there. It was incredible to experience these types of visuals. There's no way graphics are gonna get any better than this, right? This is amazing. We didn't know any better, it was the 90s, we were all stupid. What's kinda cool though is that there's not much in the way of pop-up and the draw distance is extremely good, all things considered. However, the textures will redraw as they get closer and the geometry will increase and shift, and these things are extremely noticeable. Yes, even back then. I like the end of the coastal track. Maybe I'm racing against apes? The sound is pretty boring, just car engines, tires, and the occasional beeping of your radar detector. There's no music. The game's title is accurate. It needs speed. Despite driving well over 100 miles an hour, it never feels very fast. This game was awesome in its time, but it hasn't aged well. But I'm stoked to be using my 3DO in an episode. That doesn't happen very often. In 1996, Road and Track Presents The Need for Speed came out for the Sega Saturn. Look at that, it's got a fancy new title screen. But the differences don't end there. The menu system has been redesigned with text and it's super fast now. It's truly a pleasure to navigate. The game itself is now significantly faster, not only in the frame rate, but also the speed the cars are moving on the roads. In the 3DO game, you'd be lucky if your car hit 130 miles per hour. But here they regularly hit 160 and higher. The 3DO game runs at a speed of around 18 frames per second, give or take. But this game runs at an almost constant 30 frames per second, though there can be some frame drops sometimes. Racing all 3 segments of all 3 tracks will take you about a half an hour here, maybe a touch more compared to nearly an hour on the 3DO. That's how much faster this is. The control is also much more responsive. It feels pretty good in fact. Definitely a breath of fresh air. There have been some other changes too, like there's no longer any police to worry about. There's also no traffic in this version, only the other cars that you're racing against. What's more is that there are time of day changes. You have to select this before you race. It doesn't change as you drive, but it lets you see any given track in different lighting. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool. What else? Oh yeah, there are 3 new tracks in this game which are lap-based. These are definitely a welcome addition. There's even a tournament mode for you to play through. That's right, it's an actual game now instead of just a tech demo. It puts up much more of a challenge than the 3DO game, and it feels quite balanced. The graphics don't have the odd repositioning quirks the 3DO game does. However, the Saturn game here can't quite draw the line of paint on the roads very far into the distance. Why not? There's actual music here now, and it's some pretty good stuff as well. This is light years better than the 3DO title. Road and Track presents the Need for Speed was also on the PlayStation. It's gotta be better than the Saturn game, right? I mean, it's the PlayStation! Well, in a few ways it definitely is. The opening full motion video here has been re-edited and they added some cool new music, which you're hearing right now. They harnessed the raw power of the PlayStation to draw the paint lines all the way to the vanishing point. If you ever wanted to show your friend who likes the Saturn that the PlayStation is the better machine, just point this out. Be careful though, because it might make them cry. This version also has better lighting effects. For example, when you go into a tunnel on a Saturn game, the car doesn't even get any dimmer, but on the PlayStation, the effects look pretty cool. Some of the tunnels might be a bit too dark on the PlayStation though. Also, the PlayStation has a transparent car shadow just like the 3DO game. The Saturn just has a wimpy black shadow. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. The 3 new lap-based tracks seem to run slightly better on the PlayStation than they do on the Saturn, as I imagine they were designed more with the PlayStation in mind. Unfortunately, the menu is a bit slower on the PlayStation. It's much better than the 3DO, but noticeably slower than the Saturn menu. It's hard to show in a video because you have no idea when I press any of the buttons. You just have to try it for yourself. There's a HUD in these games which has a map and generally much more info than the 3DO original, but on the Saturn you can make this HUD disappear completely while it's always there on the PlayStation. Both the PlayStation and the Saturn offer up an extra camera view from the bumper. Still no brand licensing on the steering wheels though. Graphically, the PlayStation has a lot of texture warping that neither the 3DO nor the Saturn game had. I mean, look at the windows on these buildings. You see how they're bending and warping and all that? Yeah, it's pretty ugly and honestly, kinda stupid. Here are those same buildings on the Saturn. And now on the 3DO. And now the PlayStation version again. Wow, that's just sad, Sony. The PlayStation game also adds some dither over the polygonal portion of the screen. In addition to that, there's lots of screen tearing going on in this particular version. Once you take that into account, you're getting about 22 frames per second on the low end and 27 to 29 frames per second on the high end. The PlayStation game loads more slowly than the Saturn game, but still way faster than the 3DO. Lastly, the PlayStation's AI is much tougher and more aggressive than any other version. Couple this with ever so slightly laggy control compared to the Saturn game, and you'll find yourself in first place far less often. Overall, my favorite version is the Saturn. The controls feel the best, the AI is the most balanced, and the performance is the best. Can't go wrong with this one. Okay, again, this next one didn't exactly set the world on fire when it comes to popularity, but it is a nostalgic favorite, and it was also one of the first games available on all 3 of the affordable 16-bit consoles of the time. Well, okay, the TurboGrafx-CD isn't exactly affordable, but you get my drift. Here's Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys on the TurboGrafx-CD-ROM, released in late 1991. Ys 3 came to a ton of different platforms, but I'm only going to focus on those that came west, being this, the Genesis, and the Super NES versions. I was so looking forward to this one, as I had absolutely loved the first games on the Master System, and especially the Turbo CD. This game takes place after Ys 4 and 3 years after Ys 1 and 2. This was before the series started going crazy with the chronology, but it's implied that Adol and Dogi have been on a few adventures in the meantime. The game changes the series up to a side view, and you actually press a button to attack. You can hold it to rapid swing your sword, and you can move around and jump while doing this, no problem. The other button, jumps, and select accesses your menu. Run uses an item if you have one selected. The physics are kind of floaty, but you can control Adol even in midair, so I kinda like them. It's an action RPG, meaning you gain experience and money from killing monsters, and you level up once you have so many experience points. Obviously, you can use your money to buy better equipment and other helpful items. Of course, you can also find lots of good stuff in treasure chests throughout the game. You really do need to spend a lot of time grinding, especially right at the beginning. More than most people are probably comfortable with. But it does pay off fairly quickly, and your max level is only 16.
It's too easy.
After you accomplish your goal in one area, you head back to the game's singular town, and you'll often be given a new place to explore and go do things. Basically, the story is that some people are trying to revive the evil being named Demonicus. This bad guy tormented the Tri-County area long ago, and he was defeated back then. You'll go through a whopping 5 different areas during your quest, and the game can easily be completed in a single evening. The graphics are fairly simple, but they do their best to appear modern by having parallax scrolling. Unfortunately, this doesn't work out so well on the system, as it's not natively supported by this hardware. They're basically redrawing the background to simulate this effect in software, and that results in a rather unpleasant and jerky experience. The first time you see this game scroll, it does not give you a good impression. The choppy scrolling is actually faithful to the PC-88 version. I'm not sure why they wanted to bring this over to a console. I will say though, you do get used to it after a bit, so just hang in there and get over yourself. Funny enough, there are a few sections here and there that do scroll smoothly, and they only serve to remind you how rough the rest of the game is. The music here is absolutely outstanding, just phenomenal. One of the best video game soundtracks, period. Maybe that's why it's so easy to forgive the visuals. The voice dialogue, though, doesn't fare as well as the music.
Oh, Mayor Grady. I don't know. Your name is Adol.
The acting quality takes a huge nosedive from East Book 1 and 2 on the same console, and most of it is played back in low-quality AD PCM, which makes it sound kind of fuzzy.
Molten lava is flowing down there. No man has ever returned alive.
The few real cutscenes that are here are cool, but the opening narrator is poorly translated, confusing Adol for this blonde guy who defeated Demonicus in the past.
But a real man never shows his fear. And Adol was, in fact, a most gallant soul. He battled Demonicus with equal intensity in this horrific struggle to the death.
A lot of the game is poorly translated, actually. More on that later. This game is incredibly short for an action RPG, but nonetheless, I've always found it enjoyable. The Genesis version was released in early 1992 in North America, despite being listed as 1991 on Wikipedia. I know, because I have this crap written down from when I played it, and I rented everything I didn't buy. It's simply called East 3 on its box. Once you begin a new adventure, you're greeted with an overly long story telling you about how Adol and Dogi decided to go to the land of Kenai. There is a lot of text in this intro. They got really descriptive. This is briefly told via text in one of the Turbo's title screens. Over here on the Genesis, it's also told via text, so there's no excuse for missing this story. The game structure is basically the same as on the Turbo CD, with the same areas, enemies, and level layouts. You still need to grind here, but your maximum level is only 12 instead of 16. That means you can go a bit longer between levels, and it can make grinding feel a touch more of a pain. Of course, everything is presented to you via text boxes, but you often have no idea which character is speaking because there's no graphical icon. The Turbo game got around this issue by just using voice. When Adol is talking, and he says quite a bit in this game, his text is yellow, just like the Turbo version. The slow text speed here is about the same as the fast speed on the Turbo, and the fast speed here is instant. This doesn't have the exact same translation as the Turbo CD version, but the same mistranslated names are all identical. This one has an option screen which will let you remap the control. That's right, control with 2 L's. This game has a few interesting typos here and there, like harb. Do you want to buy an arb? Or how about, yes, we carry. That's supposed to say you already have one, or that you're already carrying one. Adol's physics are better here for sure, and you can still control him in the air. Quite a nice improvement, except now it might be slightly tougher to go down the stairs. It's not really an issue though. Graphically, it's a mixed bag. It can appear to look a little worse if it's not moving. It's at a slightly lower resolution than the Turbo game, and sometimes there's less color. In fact, Adol looks like he has brown hair instead of red. However, the T-Gray Mine looks a bit more colorful on the Genesis than it does on the Turbo CD. And of course, you've noticed that the scrolling here is much smoother. No jankiness here at all. It looks and feels great. The lava inside of the volcano has some wavy line scrolling applied due to the immense heat down there. And like Valis III, this one has an interlace mode, though this time it's right in the options screen. It doesn't increase the resolution or make the text easier to read on a CRT. I like how the manual describes it. This jiggles the screen to get a clear message indication. It is not usually necessary to use this mode. I agree. The final cave has a spotlight that rotates back and forth compared to the Turbo version, which just kind of slides back and forth at a frozen angle. You can't see the skeletons in the dark on the Genesis like you can on the Turbo CD. The music is once again really good, even though it's not CD quality. It was arranged for the Genesis largely by Noriyuki Iwadare, who's mostly known for series like Lunar, Grandia, and Phoenix Wright. Most of the tunes sound quite good for a game on the system back then. This is overall a slightly more difficult game than the Turbo CD version, especially the final boss where you now have to defeat his hands first. You should still be able to beat it in a few hours though. Wanderers from Ys was also released on the Super NES in 1992. The box calls this one Ys, Wanderers from Ys 3. Okay. And this features an intro with super cool scaling that'll warp your mind. Whoa! It tells basically the same story as the Genesis intro, but it's a bit shorter. There's no text version of the story in this game. Many of the names and locations are different from the Turbo and Genesis games. For example, the town is now Redmont, not Serena. One guy is named Robert instead of Roy, and so on. The main boss is Galbalan instead of Demanicus, and the game takes place in Felgana instead of Kenai. These are all more accurate translations than the other two ports. It also doesn't have the typos that made their way into the Genesis game, thankfully. The text boxes layer over each other in this port instead of just appearing one at a time. You still can't tell who's talking in many cases though. As far as the gameplay goes, you're still going to need to grind a lot. Your maximum level is once again 16. Fortunately, you don't have to wander very far for the enemies to respawn, so grinding is faster, though it certainly doesn't feel faster. The enemies' hit points are different in this one. Most of them are significantly tougher. Overall, this is the toughest of the three versions. The final boss once again has you destroy his hands first. Adol's physics are also different in this game. He seems a bit heavier, it's like he can't jump as high. It requires a bit more effort to have him thrust downward with his sword. Oh, and there's an item in all three games called the necklace. Here it's called the Fairy Necklace. It costs 50,000 gold. On the TurboGrafx-CD and Genesis, when your life depletes, it restores you completely, automatically, without having to use an herb, or ARB. But here on the Super NES? Well, it doesn't do anything at all. It's completely worthless. How did they screw that up? This one has the biggest gameplay area, whereas the other two games are boxed in a bit more. The screen layout, graphic style, life bar style, it's all actually quite similar to how the X68000 version looks. The resolution is lower than the Genesis game and quite a bit lower than the Turbo. That makes everything here look a bit fatter. Also, Adol is always right-handed in the Turbo version, but on the other two, the sprite is flipped and he's left-handed when he walks to the right. Sometimes there are fewer layers of scrolling, but hey, at least the scrolling is super smooth. There's no line scrolling of the lava in the volcano stage, but the fire that chases you is a lot thicker than the other versions. Also, the game will give you some quick mosaic transitions sometimes. The lady in the shop bows when you're done in this version, and only this version. The cave light slides back and forth like the Turbo game instead of rotating like the Genesis, but at least you can somewhat see the skeletons in the dark. Oh, and the cutscenes are more animated here, but the artwork, honestly, kinda sucks. Have Dogi and Adol not eaten for weeks? Geez guys, is there a McDonald's around you could visit? The music is pretty good here, but a few of the compositions lack the extensions or intros of the other versions, specifically the Turbo CD. Overall, I don't think it sounds as nice as the Genesis game, and certainly nowhere near close to the TurboGrafx-CD. But still, the music here isn't bad. Let's hear an example from all three of them. One strange sound, though, is the weird clack that happens whenever enemies die. Who decided this was an appropriate sound effect? This is by far the weirdest version of the three, with the super tough enemies, non-working item that should otherwise save your life, and slightly wonky physics. But on the upside, it has 15 save slots. The Genesis only has 3, and the TurboGrafx has 5. And this is still a great game in my opinion. Objectively, the Genesis version might be the best out of these three because it has the smoothest gameplay and scrolling, but I'll always prefer it on the TurboGrafx-CD because of nostalgia. And the music. You just can't compete with that music. By the way, this game was remade for the PSP as Ys, Oath and Felghana, a port of which is coming to real consoles sometimes in the near future. And by real console, I mean not a handheld. I really look forward to it. And there you go, some multi-platform differences. I always find these changes and differences fun to look at. In fact, I may or may not do Ys 4 in the next episode because it was completely different on the two consoles it was released for. So what are some multi-platform games that you'd like to see compared? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Wow, there's so many different versions of Sega's Virtua Racing on different consoles. You got the Genesis version, you've got the 32X version, I have the Japanese version on the 32X for some reason as well. It's on the Saturn, it's even in this compilation on the PlayStation 2. It's like, what are the differences between all these versions of Virtua Racing, I wonder? If only there was a channel on YouTube that could talk about the differences in multi-platform games. Oh well, guess I'll never know. I think I might need to work on my anger issues.